Hey there, welcome to XR Industry Leaders with ArborXR. My name is Brad Scoggin, and I am the CEO and one of three co-founders of ArborXR. And we've had the opportunity of working with thousands of companies since 2016. And we've learned a ton about what it takes for XR to be successful in your organization.
And I'm Will Stackable, co-founder and CMO. This podcast is all about interviewing the leaders who are on the ground making XR happen today. True pioneers in the space, from Amazon, Walmart, and UPS to Coke, Pfizer, and beyond, to uncover the pitfalls, lessons learned, and secrets that you can use to help grow XR in your organization.
Well, Chris, thanks for sitting down with us today. I'm excited to jump in.
Same here. Very nice to be here.
So always love to hear about your personal journey, kind of. So maybe start by just sharing with our listeners, for you, what was your process of moving into XR personally?
Yeah, sure. So as you may already hear, I'm French, but I live in London. I'm in London right now. And I moved here in 2010. And until 2015, I worked in social media, trying to convince CMOs that it wasn't a fad for teenagers, having no idea how far it would come from, for better or worse. And in 2015, I was starting to look around, looking for interesting people. There was this VR thing going on, which from a storytelling point of view was quite interesting. And I did some research, and I met one rainy February afternoon in a pub in Shoreditch. I met with Julien, who had brought the DK1. I don't know if you remember the Oculus DK1. So massive gaming laptop, the two like towers, the huge headsets in the middle of a pub, right? So everyone's looking at us, and he shows me an experience called the Night Cafe. Have you tried that one?
No.
No, my first on the DK1 was the roller coaster, which made me sick. But
yeah, like that's pretty much everyone's first experience. And obviously, the first one we created was a roller coaster, which was a terrible idea, and everyone's made that mistake. But that day, he showed me the Night Cafe, which is the name of a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and a guy had recreated the painting in 3D, right? So applying the same brush to the environment, but you could walk inside a painting. And we all have that my first few seconds in the VR story. And that was mine. It was so powerful. I've always been into storytelling. And so, yeah, I essentially picked up my jaw from the floor. And a few weeks later, I quit my job and started a VR storytelling agency with Julien. So it was the beginning. So we did roller coasters, we did 360, we did, like embodied experience, a little bit of everything. That's how.
This is 2016.
That's 2016, 2017.
2016. Okay. Yeah. My first experience was not as cultured as yours. Mine was the zombie training simulator, but I had the same. I mean, to your point, like it's the same. Oh wow, this is my jaw's on the floor. How do we move into this? So tell us then from that point, you jump in to where you are today. Talk us through that journey. And I'm very curious too, as you share the journey from 2016 to Bodyswaps, maybe also just weave in your why. You know, you talked about working with social media before and then being impressed by this new technology. So maybe weave that in as well.
All right. I'm going to start with the why and then do a big detour.
Perfect.
When I did my first internship, I was in a business school. As you may notice, I stutter sometimes, and it used to be worse. I did my first internship at a suited up strategic consultancy firm in Paris, which I'm not going to name. I hated every minute of it, but I worked hard. And at the end of the 6 months, my N+2, who had never really met me face to face, comes to me and say, all right, we're going to offer you the job when you graduate. We think you're smart, but because you stutter, don't expect to go too far, right? We're not going to put you in front of the client. And that's obviously the worst thing that you can say to anyone. So I couldn't pick up the phone for 6 months. And a year later, it was my last year at business school. We had a weekend seminar, which is a thing you hate when you're a student. So I ticked the box without really knowing. It was called Managing Crisis. I arrived on the Friday morning in a room, and 12 chairs in like a semicircle, and the teacher comes in with like long hair and sneakers, which was very unlike the business school I was in. And he looks at us and he goes, "Welcome to the improv theater class." And like, the what? And I wanted to jump out of the window, but I had no choice. Like, I needed a grade. I couldn't go out. So he goes, "Okay, the first exercise, 2 of you are going to go in the middle of the room. One is going to do a political speech in a language that doesn't exist, and the other one is going to translate it sentence by sentence." And you know, my heart was in my stomach. It was horrible. I was like, well, okay, let's go for it. And you know, at that time I was so low confidence-wise that I went for it. And it's the most fun I've had in a classroom for 2 days. And at the end of it, I was like, well, I can pretend to be a tree. I can invent a new language. I can go from being a parent to being a child like that. This is bloody amazing, right? And so I put in that. That's kind of the power of soft skills. I didn't know what it was back then, but that's what I realized. My manager had terrible soft skills, and that guy here taught me something interesting. Going back to VR, 2016, 2017, we had the agency. We did like a 360 movie for a spy show. We did a climbing experience for Adidas, a raising the Champions League Cup. It was all super fun. And in parallel to that, we were giving classes in a business school in Geneva around VR as a new storytelling frontier for marketing. And always saying how, because it's embodied, the nature, the role of the creator, the role of the storyteller in VR is different. You don't control the camera, you don't control the editing, but you need to think of your audience as an embodied character, and you have to be a lot more subtle. And so we are talking a lot about the UX of storytelling in VR and referring to a body of academic research that started to emerge in both the UK and the US around 2015 around embodiment. Right? So there's been a lot of studies. What happened to your behavior in VR but outside, conscious and subconscious, short-term and long-term, when you are going to embody someone of a different race, of a different height, of a different age, of a different, all of that. And I always use those examples to justify the power of embodiment as a behavioral change machine. You know, like you had Chris Mill talk about VR is the empathy machine. No. First, he stole that's a sentence from Roger Ebert, who's a cinema critic. And two, VR is more than an empathy machine. It's a behavioral transformation machine. And there was one experience by a UK researcher called Mel Slater. He had decided to say, if you're depressed, like profoundly clinically depressed, you have too much criticism towards yourself. You don't have enough empathy towards yourself. So let's try and externalize that. So he had decided of putting 15 patients, I believe, in a motion capture suit, created an avatar that looked like them, put them in front of the mirror in VR, and after taking virtual ownership of their body, they would be confronted with a little girl crying, a character of little girl crying. They had to say nice, comforting words to that little girl for a few minutes, and then they would swap bodies with the little girl. So, and essentially watch themselves back give those comforting words. Essentially, they were giving themselves empathy. And the results were like significant and sustained. And this was like really kind of jaw-dropping experience. And in 2019, we were approached by Sage, the publishers in education, and they said, it was the first time we had an education lead. It wasn't a spy story or something for Adidas. It was like, we want to try VR to train nurses in psychiatry, and we want to put you in the shoes of a nurse. We want to put you in the shoes of a suicidal patient, which, if you think for a few seconds, being suicidal is not an audiovisual stuff, right? You cannot visualize what it's like. And so there's always this danger of I'm going to put myself in someone else's shoes in VR. And that's when we had the idea and say, well, this experience by Mel Slater, the whole body swapping stuff is brilliant. Can't we spin it on its head? And instead of it being about the patient, it can be about the practitioner. So you're going to watch yourself give words of comfort to a suicidal patient to learn about how you come across as a doctor, as a nurse. And so back then there was just one prototype we did alongside like a London Zoo experience under the Thames watching fish, that literally those two in parallel. And then we get amazing feedback. So we said, one accelerator after grants, after all of those, we said, okay, let's drop the agency completely and focus on Bodyswaps.
So interesting. So you gave two different body swap examples. I've also heard of the one. There's an experience where you go in and you're sitting in front of Freud, and he's behind a chair, and you're sharing your problems, and then you flip, and you're now Freud, and you get to hear yourself share your problem. Maybe that's connected. Can you talk a little bit about the types of content you're creating today, and is it all connected to that idea of changing and giving people a different perspective and kind of seeing themselves in a mirror in a way, or have you branched out beyond that to using other techniques as well?
I think it's evolved. The pedagogical core remains around this idea of a flight simulator for soft skills, right? So we give you we're going to give you a realistic simulation of a workplace scenario in which you're going to interact with virtual characters in different way. But it's safe, right? Because those characters, they're here 24/7, they have no judgment, they have no feelings. So, you can't hurt them. And one of the interactions is indeed that, you speak, you watch yourself back, and you get some data. But around that, we built a whole scaffolding of exercises, learn to observe characters that are good and bad at what they do, learn to make a choice by choosing the right question, self-reflect in the different ways, etc.
Talk to us then, is the focus now primarily education? And if so, are there some other specific use cases that you can share, any that you get particularly excited about?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a strange journey because we started in nursing education. Then the second prototype we did, not a prototype, the first really paid big client was safeguarding for NGOs. So imagine you're working for an NGO and someone working for the NGO or maybe a refugee comes to you and says, this happened, I've been sexually assaulted. How do you train in advance to have that kind of conversation? All right, because those are super emotionally charged. There's a lot at stake. Things can go wrong in many ways. And the way people train for that today is you get into a windowless basement and there's a middle-aged white dude going through a PowerPoint. And at some point, you're going to do a role play pretending that Dave is a 17-year-old refugee. That doesn't work. It's inconsistent. It's expensive. There's no hands-on practice. You're ticking a box. So that's how we started. It was safeguarding, and then we moved back to what we thought we knew, which was the corporate world. So we did active listening, clear communication, inclusive leadership, and we kept getting a lot of inbounds. We were selling to corporate clients and still are, and I think the adoption curve now is starting to catch up in 22. But we had a lot of education institutions coming to us and saying, we want to try new modalities. You have to factor in that, the pandemic, right? So there was this whole shakedown. I was like, do we need to reinvent ourselves as education perspective? Is it some things worked during COVID, some didn't, but there was clearly this opening of, maybe remote learning doesn't have to be shit. Maybe we can give access to underserved population to something a little bit better than a recorded video or a click-through deck. And that's what was interesting with education institution is, I'm going to say that a little bit bluntly, but for a bank to invest in active listening simulation in VR for middle managers is often perceived as a nice to have that's hard to measure. For a further education college in the UK, whose funding depends on their ability to help their students actually get job and make a living, preparing them for job interviews is mission critical. It's so close to their heart. And because of that, they are much more keen to try new things. They are educators. That's who they are. That's their nature. And so they're really happy to try new ways of educating as long as it delivers. And so that's why counterintuitively, it's actually a lot faster to start working with education institution than it is sometimes to work with corporates, at least in our experience.
I'd love to zoom in there a little bit. There's a lot of educational content being created, and some of it's very subject matter specific, frog dissection, etc. What you're talking about with job interview simulation, could you share that story specifically? And then if there's any other, it seems like you guys are finding an interesting niche in terms of the education space that isn't necessarily very deep in subject matter, like a frog dissection, but it's a life skill. Can you talk a little bit about that example, and if there's any other ones that come to mind?
And also, I'm just thinking too, talk to me as if I were a skeptic. Okay, so how do you help someone do a better job at a job interview in a VR, by spending time in a VR headset? I mean, yeah, walk us through that.
You guys went to university, I presume, right? How did you train for job interview?
Say it again.
How do you train for job interviews? Do you remember?
I think there was a gateway class where it's all, you're reading text. Maybe you do some simulation in the classroom and you take turns partnering up, but it's...
I'm thinking I had no training.
Minimal to no, very basic.
Good question.
How good were you at your first interview? Do you remember? Versus how good you would be now?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Not great.
I think
I think I showed up. I thought I just had to show up with a good resume. And the guy afterward was like, "Hey, you have a good resume, but you can't just show up. You have to actually engage in the interview."
So it's really like being good at a job interview is something you learn. Like there's a set of techniques that you can acquire, regardless of your experience and how good your CV is. And the basics are how to sit, how to look at someone, how to breathe, to manage your anxiety and your nerves. Then you're like, okay, you might think I'm a team player. All right, great. Everyone says they're a team player. No one has ever said I'm not a team player in an interview. How do you prove that you're a team player? How do you build a story from your experience that shows that you're a team player and that relates to the company and the job you're applying for? Then if I throw a weird question at you, like, would you rather be feared or loved? Okay, weird question. You probably didn't prepare for it. How do you answer that? You're probably going to say, I prefer to be loved because love is nice, or whatever. That doesn't matter, because that's not the meaning of the question. The meaning of the question is I want to get to understand how you react to something that is unexpected. And so you're going to learn the CAR technique, which is context, action, and result. Why are you asking me the question? Okay, I'm going to give you, etc. So those are a set of techniques. If you master them, then you can do a simulated interview in VR or with your friend or with a career advisor, and you will be a lot better. But in the classroom, and even with career departments, you don't get to learn those, right? You don't get to do the drills. It's like being a football player or soccer player as you would do it and play 11 asides all day, every day. You don't do that. You do drills, right? So that's why it's interesting, the whole VR approach, because you let people practice autonomously, do the drills, stack up the techniques, and then apply them in a simulation.
Are you utilizing AI?
So to an extent, we're using AI. So we're using speech to text, and then we're performing analysis on semantics, on speech emotion. Then there's the whole body language and kinematics. What we're not using AI for, which we would like to, but I don't think the state of technology allows it, is to have infinite, believable conversations with avatars. At the moment, we have a set of exercises. So we will get there eventually, but I just don't think AI is just quite there yet for something as subtle as telling a suicidal patient how she can cope better with her days. You would need a subtlety of reading, emotional input that just doesn't exist yet.
So you've got universities that are willing to pay for the content because they're seeing an uptick in their students getting jobs. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line, I guess. That's what motivates them to do it.
Yes, I mean, there's many reasons. why universities want to do it. So we have a grant with Meta that's open at the moment. So we're receiving applications. So I'm reading the applications all day, every day. And one of the questions is, what challenges are you looking to solve? They're very diverse. One is about the access, right? There's access to great learning for underserved populations that cannot pay $90,000 a year to come to the campus. So equality of education is a big one. Another one is to plug that gap where you might have, well-educated parent that put you in a good institution and you know how to come across with impact, and some kids who just as smart and just as motivated won't, simply because they didn't have 20 or 25 years of being surrounded by the right people in the right environment. And you can level the playing field a little bit. And I think a lot of education institutions understand that a university or a college is not a place anymore, it's a force. And more, you're not measured by the salary you get your students or the amount of papers that are published every year in academic journals. You're measured by the impact you can have on the community around you. And I think the world is changing in that way, and that's very good. So it's not just getting job. I think there's an idea of bigger impact and the SDG number 4 around quality of education and all that.
Definitely.
Where do you see virtual reality and augmented reality going in education specifically? I mean, it seems like there's a beachhead here with job simulation, some of these soft skills, but where do you see it? Where do you see it going?
What's interesting with some of the colleges we speak to, well, 2 years ago, when we were talking to educational institution, we had to sell the hardware as well as the software. And when we sell, I don't mean sell the actual object, I mean sell VR as a medium for learning, right? And it's a little bit like you invented Photoshop and you had to explain to people what a keyboard is, right? Or a screen. And no one would buy a laptop just for Photoshop. So, well, some people might, but it's a much harder sell. Now we get a lot of colleges that come to us and say, hey, look, we're using VR with our healthcare students for this. We're using VR with our sports students for that, with the business students for this. And I don't know how fast we're going to get there, but we're gonna reach that kind of like utility point where there's a threshold from which the number of use cases per institution makes it worthwhile for individuals to have their own headsets. So at the moment, VR is more often than not in somewhere in the library or a dedicated VR lab. Some have, borrow your headset, bring it home type stuff. But that's because, you wouldn't ask your students to buy a headset if they're going to use it five hours a year. But there is a point where it's going to become a search screen. If you think about it, your Quest costs what, $300? The price of a book, an academic book, is $75 to $100. So it's not that crazy. So when we reach that utility point, suddenly you're going to start seeing some institution deploying at real scale. Up until a moment, like right now, you wouldn't go to university if you didn't have a laptop and a smartphone, or it would just be weird. And as I think at some point we're going to reach a stage where mixed reality, I don't know exactly what the split is going to be, of course, but that's going to be your search screen. And that's going to be there's this idea of the university of the future, organized in layers. And the core is the campus experience. That's where the face-to-face is the most important. And as you go out in layers, you go further into the metaverse, right? And the outer layer is students who never set foot on campus. And how do you give those students an experience that's as close as possible? Not as in, the walls of the virtual university look the same as the real thing. I don't think it's the point. Just right. The sense of belonging to a community, the engagement you have with the learning is comparable. And obviously that outer layer is the accessible one, right? It's the one where you can study at the best university in the world without having to get in debt for the rest of your life. So I'm hopeful, and that's maybe wishful thinking, but that immersive technologies in general are going to be the conduit that enable this whole vision of, the MOOC, the massive online courses that kind of took off, but not really, because the engagement dropped very, very fast. I'm hoping that that's the technology that's going to pass the threshold of engagement to make remote learning fun.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I mean, we're seeing a lot of really powerful results from different companies we work with when it comes to either retention or reducing time to learn. And some very significant data. And to me, listening to you talk, it's like, well, that's great and that's really important, but that's kind of half the equation. The other half is the accessibility, which makes it even more exciting.
And the engagement and the ability to have communities online, and
exactly. Yeah. And so to me, it's just powerful. So how far away are we from that in education? What's your prediction?
To be honest, I'm not a good crystal ball gazer. If I was, I would be probably like richer now. I wouldn't have invested in crypto like they're all saying, So no, I don't know. I just know 2022 has been a very, very interesting year. Every year we say, it's going to be the year in VR. I think for us, we've seen adoption. We just signed a deal with a group of 10 colleges in the UK who bought 500 headsets and a 3-year license, and they're planning to train every single one of their students on job interview and presentation skills. And we're not talking like Ivy League innovation budget to spare. No. That's going to be core part of the curriculum. And that's new, right? Because that's when you cross the threshold from innovators trying to validate stuff and push out some research papers, which we need to get as the early majority. That's everyone's going to have to do it. And they're not going to do VR because it's fun or new. They're going to do it because it's the best, most efficient way to learn.
Because it works. Yeah. We're definitely seeing, it feels like, you talk about 2022. Last year when we would go to conferences, it felt like a topic of discussion was still, does VR work? Where this year it's felt more, how do you scale VR?
Yeah.
And so you talk about the challenges a year or two ago of even selling the hardware, or getting buy-in to the technology and not just being kind of this fun thing on the side. What challenges today? Like, what are the challenges you still face when you're going to go roll out 500 devices across 10 universities?
That's it. I think that's the biggest challenge, and I don't know how to. So one thing we say to institutions is for every pound you're going to spend on hardware and software, you need 2 pounds for change management. You need to procure the hardware, you need to manage the fleet, you need to train your facilitators, you need to communicate to the faculty, you need to communicate to the students, you need to measure the results, you need to. It's never ending. It's the idea of the whole product model, right? You can have the best VR simulation in the center. If you don't have all the human element around it to make it happen, it's never going to happen. And to your point, obviously you guys are ArborXR, you exist to solve that challenge, and that challenge is real. And that at the moment is almost a glass ceiling when it comes to scale that is not related to the appetite from the learners, that is not related to the appetite from the faculty, that is not related to the technology itself, whether it's the performance of the cost. It's related to that. How do we scale? How do we go from the one laptop in the office to everyone having one at home? That's the era we're in right now, I think.
That's interesting. If you were looking back, you've been in this for a long time now. There's a lot of people who are just now getting started, and particularly maybe if we dialed into schools and universities that are looking at doing a pilot project. What's the advice? You gave a great piece of advice there. Spend 2 pounds for every 1 pound on hardware and software, just on the training and all the other stuff around it. But what other advice do you have for somebody starting with a pilot project?
A couple. One is, if you have a trouble with buy-in. So what we found is generally when we enter universities, it's rarely the dean that comes to us and pushes it down. It's quite often someone who is a VR champion, an educator, or someone who works in library or in learning innovation is like, I want to bring it to the campus because I know it works. I believe in it. But so you need to help them get that buy-in. And it sounds very, very silly, but to get buy-in, you need to put headsets on people's heads. Otherwise, they're just not going to listen to you. So that part of the equation is get people to put headsets on. The other part of the equation is run your pilot as small as possible. There's a lot of free, I mean, we do it, but I'm sure most vendors would do it. You can get like trial licenses for free. You can get a couple of headsets for $500. If you go refurbished, even cheaper. And most apps have data. They're like built in the app. And if they don't, you can run like questionnaires with Google Forms or, it's, and so if you get to your faculty member and said, try it out, get that wow effect that we discussed, the Van Gogh or the roller coaster, like get the wow effect and see what the students are saying, then you can generally unlock some buy-in funding to do something a little bit more significant.
So let's say you get the dean in the room, he's going to try to put on the headset for the first time. What's your go-to content for that? Go-to experience?
Well, it's Bodyswaps.
Well, yeah, you got a lot of them though. I'm saying which one of your, if you're going to pick one and you say you've got 5 minutes. Yeah.
No, exactly. So we learned the hard way before. We're like, oh, which module do you want to do? The gender inclusion or the job interview? The job interview one is 90 minutes. And even the gender inclusion, which is one of the shortest, you only get to do the Bodyswaps, which is our wow moment, after about 13 minutes. That's just too long in the context of a demo. So we built a medley sort of module that lasts 8 minutes, and you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of that. And so you get to experience the breadth of the pedagogical approach without actually doing the learning. It's more about, okay, I get how this works, I get the quality of it, and I get pedagogically what I could do with it.
That's brilliant. For anybody listening, I'm just going to highlight that. That's such a great, I think, nailing the demo. Oftentimes with key stakeholders, you only have one shot, and they need to get that aha moment that it may be, for some, it happens immediately. So I love that. So 8 minutes, and they get a range of different types of experiences, and they also get to see your approach.
Yeah, and we do something that is maybe I wouldn't say sneaky, but I'm going to explain. It's going to make sense. So the first element of the medley comes from the gender inclusion demo. And in that modality, we call it an observation. You are meeting with Sam and Sophie. So you have a body, you work in that company, and you see those two characters around the table, and they're coming to you to give you progress on a project. And your job, they're going to talk to one another, and your job is to click on the trigger every time you hear or see Sam on the left say or do something that's inappropriate towards Sophie. And at the back, you have the screen. You have 10 shots, right? And you have 8 behaviors to pick. And you essentially scored in real time. If you get it, it appears on the screen. If you click and you make a mistake, you get a noise. When you're in the room, there's generally more than one stakeholder, which means there's one that is in VR being essentially assessed in real time on their capacity to identify a sexist asshole, whilst everyone else is looking at them. No one is bored at that moment ever, because there's a little bit at stake. So that works quite well.
That's funny. And do you tie into the existing LMS at these universities, or how do you work in? I mean, how do you connect into
LMS
the kind of
is
overall
learning
curriculum?
management system. It's what universities use to track user progress and restore it all.
So, oddly enough, we hear a lot about we would like to integrate it, but at the moment it has materialized only in a couple of times. I reckon that further down the line it will be systematic. What we hear maybe more about from universities and colleges, I talked about that point of utility, the idea that you need to, the more use cases you have in any given single institution, the more VR is gonna start to be embedded. And what colleges and universities tell us is, well, there's those 32 apps that we would like to use. We love them, we tested them, they're great, but they have 32 different pricings, 32 different platforms, different stakeholders, different data privacy policy, and it's a nightmare. And so I'm waiting for an entity to act as the distribution middle ground that makes it easy for the institution to go, okay, here's the catalog. I want to buy this and this and this for that many users for that long. And I know by clicking here that I make sure that the data is used properly because it's been validated and so on. And that's, I don't know who's going to do that. Is it going to be one of the manufacturers? Is it going to be one of you guys? Is it going to be one of the big players existing in the industry? That's going to be very interesting to follow.
Interesting. We're coming up on time here, but I've got a hot take. I know you said you don't do crystal balls, but here's one that I think you maybe have a good answer for. So 10 years from now, looking back, what surprises you about XR? What's something that surprises us?
One, I have absolutely no idea because I believe in Amaras Law. Do you know Amaras Law? You heard about that idea?
Sure. Tell us.
So Amaras Law is you with new technologies you tend to overestimate what happens the first 5 years and to underestimate what happens the following. Simply because there's a compounded evolution and so having started in social media in 2009, I had no idea that it would lead to Trump being elected, but to also to the Arab Spring, and that you would have TikToks, and that's it's. So I honestly I cannot answer your question. I don't think any of us has. If I ask you what are going to be the top 3 use cases for extended reality in 2031, I don't think any of us would get the 3 of the top 5 right. I just don't think it's possible yet.
That's a fair point. Okay, I've got one more for you then. This one, and this could be on any range of topics, but when you look out into the future a bit, and again, I know you're not. When you look in the future, what are you most excited about when it comes to AR, VR, AI, crypto, blockchain, metaverse? Like what gets you personally excited?
There was this analogy when I was teaching in Geneva. I was doing about augmented reality, mixed reality, and VR. And there was this idea that when you create in a VR, you're God, and when you create for augmented reality, you're shaman. And what I mean by this is that in VR, you create something that doesn't exist, right? You create ex nihilo, a world in which you're going to be entirely embodied. Whereas augmented reality, it's a little bit like a shaman in the way that you're making a layer of information appear where it didn't exist before. Let me give you an examples. You could be at a conference and you have your mixed reality glasses and you turn on the LinkedIn app, and suddenly above everyone's head, you see, oh, here's an investor, here's a client, here's a vendor. You could have a dating version of that. You could have a nature's loving version of that where you see what tree that is. You can have a historical version of that where you walk in Soho in London and you have the music history of the neighborhood. And I think connecting the humongous digital layer of information and contextualizing it visually in real time as you go about your life, essentially re-enchanting the world, that I think is very, very interesting. Scary as well, but exciting.
Yeah, it can be a little scary. But Chris, this has been really, really good. We appreciate so much your time. I know you're a busy man. And we'll have info about how our listeners can find Bodyswaps. But if people want to hear from you specifically, is LinkedIn the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, but I don't think I sent a single tweet besides complaining to airlines for about 5 years. So that's probably
Well, that actually sounds interesting. I may want to follow you for that reason. But
it works very well. It's kind of a shortcut to getting heard.
That's awesome.
That's great. Well, it's been good, Chris. I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Cheers. Likewise.
Thanks,
I guess.
Well, man, Chris is a very impressive guy. And to me, we talk a lot about the learning enhancements that companies are finding from VR in the training space. But listening to Chris talk, it's like really the same thing is happening in education. And I leave that episode feeling really excited about what's going to happen for VR in the EDU space.
Yeah, they really are cutting edge. Going back to my background as a marketer and as a storyteller, I just think it's so fascinating, his focus on embodiment and using VR. We've all talked about VR as an empathy machine, but the idea of VR as a behavioral transformation machine, it got me excited, made me think that we've all had that experience watching a movie and feeling transported. We've all put on a headset and stepped into somebody else's shoes, and Bodyswaps is using those mechanics to really make a difference in the world. So it gets me personally really excited.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you consume podcasts, and we look forward to seeing you next time.